And now a short piece of fiction, which I'm happy about. My fiction is usually very long. The Immigrant. No one understood the new chill in the wind or the fog and mist that suddenly swirled around the tall buildings of downtown. Although it was almost summer, meaning sweltering heat and obnoxiously humid air, the residents of the city suddenly found themselves shivering as if it was winter. The fog drifted through the streets like a cloud that had suddenly wandered off. Everyone was befuddled and cold. By the river that flowed next to the city, a crowd gathered. First, only one person had seen it, a birder named Jill who had been watching the ternsfish. Through her binoculars, she saw something strange. At first it seemed nothing more than a dark triangle on the horizon. Then it grew into a much bigger, lighter triangle. When Jill realized it was not a large sail ship, she stood dumbfounded. She watched it float up across the lake to the river and anchor there with an icy crunch. Word spread quickly, and soon, as I said, a crowd gathered. Some were frightened, some were laughing, some were angry. All were gazing up at the newest immigrant to their fair city. It was an iceberg. Most of the people had never seen an iceberg before. Their only experience of such spectacles were on TV, and high definition or not, it did not prepare them for the truly sublime experience of standing near an iceberg. The chunk of ice was larger than the tallest buildings. From a distance, it seemed that their city had grown a mountain overnight. Standing under the iceberg gave everyone a sense of scale that was not entirely comforting. This impression was enhanced by the occasional shard of ice that detached from the side of the iceberg and crashed downward. With a terrific splash, it thundered into the lake. The iceberg was not white. It was mostly gray with a deep blue interior. The color came from the ice that had already melted, leaving a pepper of sediments. The original iceberg must have been several times its present size, a daunting prospect. It was not endowed with winter's aesthetic sense of silence either. The iceberg made noises, growls, cracks, rumbles, creaks. The sound was like a perpetual threat, or, some said, a plea for help or attention. Then there was the sensation of it. The iceberg seemed to generate its own wind. Standing under it, your hair fluttered. A chilly but bracing wind coursed down the mountain of ice, cool and moist. When this air moved into the city, it clouded into massive iceberg-fed fogs that cloaked the city in a mystical shroud. Standing near the iceberg was such a cool, electric experience. Some claimed it cured their cold, or stomach ache, or knee pain, or migraine. Others said it caused the same. It seemed that everyone in the city had nothing else to do but speculate about the iceberg. Productivity in the workplace hit a new low. It was difficult to work in an office building when suddenly a wind would pull the curtain of fog away, and there it was, the great gray and blue iceberg, so close you feel you could touch it, flocks of white birds circling it. There was no other topic of conversation. Every afternoon, after work, it seemed the whole population of the city walked down to the lake to look at it and ponder the thousand things humans ponder at such a sight. Television crews came from across the country to film the iceberg. Professors and meteorologists were asked to speculate on where it had come from and how it had managed to get there. There were maps and graphics and touch-screen flat panels to help explain how impossible this was. Certainly no one had ever heard of an iceberg making such a journey intact. It was, they said, highly unlikely. The authorities that handled such things were investigating the chance that it was terrorism. Climate terrorism, they termed it. The people who were usually frightened by such things were frightened. The iceberg also brought with it a surprising array of fauna. Innumerable seabirds nested upon it. Some species had never been seen in the area before. In the water about the iceberg, schools of fish fed on the algae that had grown on it for eons. Seals fed on those fish, and the city was dumbfounded to witness sharks feeding upon the seals. The iceberg seemed to draw local wildlife as much as it did humans. River otters were seen basking on it. Foxes had emerged from whatever urban hole they had been hiding in to run about the iceberg. Scientists were astonished to see just how quickly their fur turned from red to a dusky gray. Soon the iceberg was the center of a rich biodiversity of animals and plants, all of them ecstatic to find this floating biota of food and shelter. Meanwhile, the police roped off the entire lakeside of the city. The last thing they wanted was to have some fool teenagers attempt to scale the iceberg, which of course happened anyway. The two were 17 and 16. One was named Evangeline and the other Sam. They made it to the top without trouble and hoisted up a flag with an obscene gesture painted upon it. A cracking landslide cut off their descent. It was good television to watch the two rascals lifted from the iceberg with military helicopters. They were formally charged, but nothing came of it. They could hardly be said to have trespassed because the law was murky when it came to the idea of who owned large floating bits of ice. Evangeline's father was a lawyer. Soon after this stunt, everyone began to shift their focus from wonder to consternation. Something had to be done. Plans circulated of every kind. Since estimates of the time it would take the iceberg to naturally melt away ranged from 6 weeks to over 300 years, some wanted to blow the iceberg up into smaller chunks so it would melt faster. After all, they argued, their lake was not supposed to be inhabited by seals and sharks and flocks of strange seabirds. This was underlined when a pod of killer whale was seen swimming around the iceberg, attracted by the seals, no doubt. A local company wanted permission to bottle the iceberg water and sell it for a handsome profit. Some said it could be a tourist destination to rival Yellowstone's geysers. They produced plans of a riverside theme park over which the iceberg would loom, cracking and creaking, the sound of money being made. Others wanted the iceberg to be preserved. They argued it had been the most positive event for their city in modern memory. They wanted to build a huge scaffold to shade the iceberg from the sun. Others wanted the iceberg to be left alone, to be ignored if at all possible. Let nature run its course, they said. Fences needed to be built, electrified if possible. Guards needed to be posted. Attack dogs. Still others thought the iceberg should be studied intensively by qualified scientists. They argued that perhaps great floating mountains of ice could be expected more often in the future. The Earth was changing, they said, and they needed to understand that. Soon the iceberg became the center of a nationwide debate. People on television fought fiercely over what should be done and why. Every scenario was argued about fiercely. Towing such a massive weight of ice was impossible, engineers said. Building a shade for the iceberg would be a marvel, but more importantly, it would cost a fortune. Blowing it up was too unpredictable, fencing it off was undemocratic. Selling the iceberg water was democratic, it was agreed, but it could not be ascertained who had the right to buy what and from whom. It was difficult to make any kind of plan until it was decided whose iceberg it was. The courts began to try to work out the legal status of icebergs. The city park system said it was theirs, as the iceberg had run aground, at least partially, on park land. The city said it was under their jurisdiction because it was fully located within city lines. The state said it was theirs because, in order to get to the city, the iceberg had to float through several county lines. And the federal government claimed it was theirs, using much the same argument, because the iceberg originated in another country. An environmental group was also arguing that the iceberg was not anyone's